Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Cort, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. It's been, I think, almost now, about a year and a half since you were last on. Do you mind introducing yourself again to everyone out there listening?
Gosh, has it been that long? Yeah, not at all, Rob. I'm happy to be back. Thanks for inviting me again. My name's Ben Ford. I live in Colorado, and I work inside of the treatment and recovery world. Well, I guess I do a bunch of different things, but my main jobs are inside of the treatment and recovery world. So working with adults who have substance use disorder, addiction, and really like to focus on the ones who also have a co-occurring mental health disorder. We really like to work with the very sick. And I spend a lot of my time trying to understand and then educate around the issues with today's THC and what's going on in the crazy world of commercial cannabis sales.
Now, since the last time we talked, has commercialization changed at all? Or have you been able to notice if it's been more of a positive discussion being talked about it with both sides of the argument, where there's obviously people that are pro for it, a lot of people are, but there's also starting to be more skepticism, I've noticed, at least in my town, about people using cannabis. I think because of the potency levels, but also people aren't very happy with the commercialization of the product.
Yeah, I've also seen a change. And if it was about a year and a half ago that we spoke last time, I mean, there were still plenty of people who like would question the idea if one could even get addicted to THC or if it could be harmful. And I haven't heard those objections in quite some time. It's really become much more commonly accepted that this isn't the panacea that everybody was promised. This isn't like the only vice substance on earth that alters your mood that has absolutely no negative effects to. So yeah, man, I definitely feel like the conversation is evolving. It's getting more nuanced. People are willing to engage differently. The frustrating thing for me remains how it is with any giant corporate interest that you're fighting is the lobbyist and the executives on the other side of this. It's all about the money for them, so they won't compromise. They won't hear any sort of reason. Like if it's going to get in the way of their bottom line, they're going to fight you on it. But that's not unexpected. Lobbyists are going to do what lobbyists are going to do.
Could you give me an example of maybe a roadblock of what a lobbyist would do?
Yeah, for sure. In Colorado recently, we passed something called House Bill 1317, which did a number of things. And its initial idea was to try and get some sort of potency cap on products in the state because, I mean, for your listeners who aren't familiar, what naturally occurs inside of the cannabis plant is less than half of a percent THC. And THC is the part of the plant that gets you high. You start to see issues with it showing up. Well, depending on how old a person is, but 8 to 10% THC is when we start to see some real issues in the human brain and body. And we're selling products that are 99.9% pure THC. So when we attempted to negotiate any sort of cap, and I was in the room in all these conversations, the lobbyists they said this is the craziest thing. They were like, "Well, you can't prove that that it's unsafe to consume at 99%." And I said, "Well, we absolutely can prove that." And they said, "No, you can't. And until you can prove it, we're going to keep selling it." And the point that we were all making was it's not on the consumer. The burden isn't on the consumer to prove it's safe. The burden is on the person who's selling it to prove that it's safe. And what it came down to with them was I remember second day or so in negotiations, I said, look, let's start at 30%. The doctors, the scientists, everybody wants it zero. The industry wants it 100. I said, let's start at 30% and negotiate. And they said, there is no negotiation whatsoever. We will accept absolutely no potency cap, period, end of story. And they haven't.
Why are they pushing so much for not having a cap on their potency?
Oh, brother, the math is simple. The higher the potency, the more addictive the product, period. I mean, it's the same reason why tobacco manufacturers don't want to stop adding nicotine to their products. Like, um, there are the three big factors that will determine whether or not somebody will use in a problematic way. Um, Potency is one of the three. The others are age of onset, when they start, and how frequently they use. So the goal is to create the frequent and chronic user. That means you got to get them young, you got to get them using often, and most importantly, you have got to get them using the strong stuff.
Well, if they're asking for you to bring evidence to the table, what about the argument of the psychosis discussion, which a lot of kids are experiencing when they're using such high potency drugs now?
So the evidence is ample. There's absolutely more than enough. The trick you've got is them continuing to say that there isn't. Um, Sometimes, man, I get a little, I don't know what the right word is, nihilistic about the state of politics in our country. I mean, imagine that. Um, they don't, it's not about truth, it's about who's got the loudest voice. And what you find is that people with the most money have the loudest voice. And if you can afford to run PR campaigns and things, you can convince the world of anything. I mean, look at look at the state of our country today, brother. You can't wherever your politics lies or anybody else's. I really don't care. I mean that. Um, you can't tell me that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are the best two Americans that there are to run our
Well,
country.
it's always the lesser of two evils is the discussion. It's like I don't like any of the choices, so I'm just going to sit off to the side.
Yeah, and listen, man, we have those choices not because they've risen to the top as the best. We have them because there's the most money behind them. And the same thing happens in public policy. I mean, shit, we knew, I forget, can we cuss on your
Yeah,
podcast?
you're good.
Oh, shit. We knew like the first Surgeon General's warning on tobacco came out in the early 1900s. Like most folks don't even know that. Like we knew how dangerous tobacco was forever. And it was 20 years ago that every CEO of every major tobacco company in this country testified under oath before Congress that their products weren't addictive. Like truth doesn't matter. I can give you objective scientific fact. The problem is what matters is public opinion and what people believe.
So, if we were going to talk about having a discussion with the public, how would you try and bring people who might not be fully informed on the discussion into the actual discussion? I usually try and bring up that obviously there's a commercialization factor, but mostly having the discussion on cannabis when it comes to potency.
I mean, that's the core of it, man. What you're asking is what I spend a lot of my life trying to do, and I guess the best you got to go slowly at first. You can't, everybody's worldview of this is so slanted in favor of because we just heard one side from people who were making money off of it for so long. You can't like you got to tell somebody they're in the matrix kind of slowly, or else it's going to get too intense. And I always start with just the potency thing. Like I am more than happy to give over to anybody that cannabis in and of itself is has very few issues associated with it. However, people aren't consuming cannabis in anything that looks like its natural form. This is a concentrated form of THC that has been manufactured with specific intent to make money, and that means to addict people. So I usually start there. And if people will come with me from the like, listen, I'm not dogging the plant. I'm not talking about the thing that humankind's interacted with forever. I'm talking about the thing that for the last 10 years, corporate America has shoved down your throat and ruined. That's what I'm talking about. To kind of get there that way, sometimes I think you got to present science slowly. Um, One thing that I can tell you, I'm pretty sure of studying these things and seeing how it's played out in the past is we will get there. Like eventually America will wake up to the science of things. It just takes us a long time. Like from when we can say something is absolutely true scientifically, from that point until when the American public understands it, That's the point we're in right now. We're somewhere in that transition, and I hope it's a short transition because there's a lot of hurt coming about from it.
Why do you think there's so much demonization if you're fighting the opposite side of the pro legalization? Not even in the sense of wanting it to be illegal. There's obviously medical benefits that come with cannabis, but it's just about having the discussion about like, hey, there is some serious concerns with kids that are going to be experiencing drugs for the first time, and let's not let their first time be with a 1,500 milligram cake pop. That would just be a terrible experience for anybody.
Yeah, right. Why is there so much? Because they defined the message. And this started to happen, well, really started to happen 30 years ago, but 15 years ago or so was when it got really serious. And what they did was co-opted any arguments against by saying, hey, listen, these are what the crazy reefer madness, like super right wing, prohibition loving fun police are going to say. And so then every time somebody said it, they were like, ah, we knew that was coming. So you had this generation that grew up on really sound messaging about how harmless it was and about how we should legalize. And um, they never heard the other side to it. And if they did hear the other side, they really were conditioned to write those arguments off because, like, oh, yeah, I knew that shit was coming. They told me you were going to say that.
What about the people like academics? Like I've talked to a few of them that study kind of the negative effects, specifically when it looks at mental health disorders. Do you ever bring that up to people that are maybe fighting the side of just there's nothing wrong with pot ever when you really start talking about mental disorders? Because we have a lot more of it, at least it's being diagnosed a little bit more frequently. I think we're more aware of it with technology and just understanding of it that I would see a lot more of a rise of impacts from certain drugs, either if it, whether it's beneficial, but also the negative as well too, especially when we talk about psychosis. That's a big area for me because there's not undoing psychosis when it starts to happen.
No, once you've had one psychotic episode, you're twice as likely to have another. Um, yeah, I push the mental health thing big. I mean, frankly, Robbie, I think that so what really undid cigarettes in this country was the link to cancer. I think that what will ultimately change the tide of this conversation is the link to mental illness and psychosis, because that link is so established, and it's a much, much higher likelihood of developing psychosis from high potency THC than it is cancer from tobacco. Much higher likelihood that that's when we can't really argue with. And because it's hit so close to home so many times, I can get pretty feisty about that one. Like if somebody's like, no, that's not a thing, I'll push back really hard on that, because the amount of cannabis induced psychosis I have seen, the amount of suicides that have followed, I mean, there's so many lives in my immediate world that are never going to be the same, if they're still even in existence because of cannabis induced psychosis. And yeah, man, I'll yell about that one to people, because to write that off is to write off a very real experience of hundreds of thousands of people around this country. And that's not okay.
When you speak to someone who's suffered from a cannabis psychosis or cannabis-induced psychosis, can you might explain an experience? I think I've had a few of them. I have ADHD and I've just have always had a bad reaction to marijuana. And when I would explain some of what I would experience, people are like, "Did you take acid?" I was like, "I swear to you, it was just reefer. It was just cannabis. It's all I took." But I just had this weird kind of what looked like an acid trip. I can only describe it as. And
Yeah, man.
I have not been right since used doing that before. So and I looked it up on I found it on a Reddit, which was people that started talking about mental illness, certain disorders like ADHD and others can have this weird kind of reaction with taking cannabis. Since when I started finding researchers to speak about it. But from your experience with people that have either experienced a bad trip or experienced something that not the green out effect, but something that was a form of psychosis from it. What have you learned that you can relate to others who haven't ever had that experience or maybe have never even bothered trying the drug?
Well, I'll first tell you that the science is complete on this one. There is as much as anybody wants to learn. You can read white paper after white paper, study after study. We know this, but you're asking about my experience. That's simple. um, 2 years ago, maybe. No, that's about a year ago. I worked with the Washington Post they wrote a multi-part article on this, and they wanted to see our numbers in the treatment center where I work. And so we pulled them, and we found that we were treating about 40 cases of THC-induced psychosis for every one case of amphetamine-induced psychosis. So psychosis is, and I think this is where you got to start, man. Psychosis is this big catch-all word for crazy would be the pejorative, like any form from anxiety and depression to schizophrenia and everything in between. We use psychosis as like a generic word for all mental illness. And what we know is that there are two ways to develop psychosis. One is biological, and it's just in your genes. It's going to happen to you, a pretty small portion of the population. And the other is chemical. You end up in the same place. You end up in this state of acute psychosis, but you're either going to get there from your genes or you're going to get there from chemicals you put in your body. And it's always been amphetamines. I mean, think of Scarface, man. That like the second half of the Scarface movie is like the most perfect example of amphetamine-induced psychosis you can imagine. And we always, like in my world, all chemical-induced psychosis was amphetamines. And now we're seeing 40 to 1 THC instead of amphetamines. What this looks like is I mean, there's an expectation we have, which with everybody who admits with THC as primary or as a big thing, that they're going to be um, in a state of psychosis. And almost, I guess, the majority of what we see is delusional. There's a lot of intense paranoia. There's, I mean, certainly on a daily basis, there are people who are surveillance seems to be a big thing they're worried about. You know, needing to unscrew light bulbs and cover up uh, outlets and things. It seems like that's a really common hysteria that folks have, feeling like people are trying to surveil and trying to kill them. There's a lot of um, grandiose and unrealistic thinking. For example, there was a gentleman who admitted a couple of weeks ago who, in some ways, he's in a great frame of mind. He's like, I really need help. I can't stop. Somebody help me with this. And then um, as soon as he got there, he was like, I'm so glad to be here, but you guys have to know I got to be gone by next Saturday, which we're a month-long minimum program. And we said, do you have to be gone next Saturday? He's like, yeah, I'm meeting Drake and the whole crew in Taiwan. And, you know, I got to do shows with him there. You know, I'm his backup singer. So you see everything from the extreme paranoia to the total delusional. Sometimes it's just it can be a pretty scary fear that they've got of kind of everything around them. Sometimes they're aware, like you are, that stuff's not quite right. Sometimes they have no idea. Sometimes it bounces back, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's one of the things that gets so frustrating for me with these profiteers and these corporations and these lobbyists who are like, it's harmless, it's harmless. I'm like, man, you need to sit with somebody whose kid isn't bouncing back from this shit and tell me that. It can be pretty rough.
From the people that have admitted to having cannabis addiction or seeking treatment, what other experiences besides psychosis? I've noticed kind of like people talking about their life being on freeze. Like it just felt like they were kind of getting like autopilot, kind of. Like the drug was something to do, and then the day was over. Next thing you know, it's been 20 years or it's been 10 years. And you're like, where did the time go? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? It's like their ambitions were killed.
That's the thing about weed. Listen, fortunately, unfortunately, people are getting to a state of recognition that it's a problem much faster now because of how strong it is. But the problem with cannabis, THC, whatever, man, is that it's so socially acceptable, and you're not overdosing. Nobody's having a heart attack, or Narcan's not having to come in and bring them back to life. So yeah, you downplay the significance of it, and I get to work with a couple Native American tribes. It's one of the things I'm most proud of in my career right now. And there's one I work with who calls, and meth is their problem, meth and alcohol. But we talk about cannabis a lot with their kids because they call it the dream killer. So it's not this like meth, fentanyl kind of tragic end that people are going to have, but it's 10 years later, everybody's like, man, I expected more from him. He was so smart. Always kind of figured he'd do something. Never really got a job. Never really did whatever. And I think the dream killer is such a good way to think about it. Um, there's also a medical term associated with frequent cannabis consumption that's not associated with anything else. It's really interesting if your listeners want to look it up. It's called chronic apathy. And I mean, you put those two things together, and it's just like they don't give a shit. So you have, and we all can think of these people. We can also think of exceptions, but we also need to remember that there are so many people for whom that is the reality that you nailed it, man. Like you're using. Next thing you know, it's the next day. Next thing you know, it's 20 years.
I have to ask, would you consider looking into private organizations running this instead of the corporations and or maybe taking it to a federal level, bringing down some laws to bring on some things? Because it seems like we're just dealing with companies that are just making money off this thing and there's not really a whole lot of, or at least if there is regulation, it's kind of in sketchy areas.
Totally. My last book, I suggested this. I have a book right now. This should be out next month, actually. It's in layout and print should start pretty soon. Um, I actually have a chapter exactly how to do this if we want to do this. And it's got to have federal involvement. Like this can't be done on a state by state level. It's absolutely doable. The problem is it would take some real effort by the feds. And shit, man, like I don't know if they could agree what day of the week it is in Congress right now, let alone tackle something this significant. But Uruguay has done it. Um, Granted, Uruguay is a country of about 5 million people, so much easier to do something like that, but they pulled it off. Um, it is absolutely doable if we stop giving lip service to wanting to help and actually help. Like this whole the mental health crisis we're having, the overdose crisis, the addiction crisis that we have. These things you never fix them, but they could be so dramatically lessened if we would put the resources into it. I just don't see any of those dipshits in Washington putting the resources into it.
How would you take a step forward, like if you were going to put a resource into it? Like, what would be a first thing, like a good starting basis?
The place you have to start is the federal oversee. Where would it come from? And I suggest ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Make it ATF and M because states don't have the infrastructure to police consumable products. It's not inside of them. That's done at the federal level. So I would bring it under the ATF. Then you make universal laws, and the very first law you start with is a potency cap. And then you have to do the testing. So before anything rolls out for sales, you've put it under ATF, you've built a regulatory infrastructure, you have funded the actual enforcement of that. Because right now, nobody's funding the enforcement of it. Everybody goes from being an enforcement official. I wrote this in the book too, to working directly for the industry. You do away with that, and then you figure out how you're going to test a representative sample to make sure that the products that are coming out meet the requirements for potency and also purity. They don't have carcinogens and heavy metals and things. And I think that'll probably take 3 or 4 years. But I also, in the forthcoming book, I gave a way to pay for it. Like we could do it. But the first thing we need is a federal enforcing agency and then real infrastructure to test the products.
What about when it comes to the percentages? If it gets too low, do they have to disclose that they have it involved in the product? Because we have so many products now. Like I would put a cap on just what products you can sell that has cannabis infused with it. I accidentally used a shampoo one time that had it in there, and I had to like I had to try and figure that out at work, but it wasn't enough obviously to give you like a actual high or anything, but you're sitting there like, well, I don't know what this would do to me. I'm sensitive to this drug in particular. So I would like not, just to be wary if there's something in there, but you don't know. You go to some of these shops or if you go to sometimes you can go to just a regular store, grocery store, and they might have something in an aisle that might say it really small at the bottom. Well, most people aren't looking at that. They look at the giant bold lettering that says milk and honey is the scent. And like, I like that. It's better than smelling like shit.
Um, yes, something like that. Uh, so typically, the way that we govern those things is through the FDA. Consumables are FDA governed. Both that and enforcement is at the federal level if we were to do the ATF thing. So yeah, for sure, you have to have because right now, Rob right about this too. There's absolutely no standard for what is cannabis infused, THC derived, full spectrum hemp included. Like all these words are bullshit. They mean nothing because we have no standards for what they mean. So you can claim anything you want. Like there are people selling um, CBD infused clothing, which, okay, that's not possible, but they're selling it and people are buying it because good advertising. Here's a good one for you. Let me finish answering your question, and then I'll give you this example because it's a doozy. They have to have standards of what is what. And then those have to be standards that are nationwide. Like we can't have this just because I say it's this. And right now, without FDA oversight, they can't. Have you seen CBD infused beverages
I
out
have.
east?
Yeah. They make your
They're at
tongue numb if you drink them.
okay, they're at every gas station out here. I mean, they're everywhere. CBD infused beverages or something. I write quite a bit about this in the book. CBD is hydrophobic, meaning it hates water. CBD molecules cannot bind to liquid. So CBD, without a really intense process to make it happen that nobody's doing. So the CBD that's being put into this liquid can't bind to the liquid. However, CBD binds really well to aluminum and other metals. So any trace amount of CBD that actually was put in there, which they don't have to put any in if they don't want to because no one's policing it, is going to bind to the can and not even come out in the liquid because the CBD molecule flees from a liquid molecule. So that's just one example of the absolute bullshit that this market is, where everybody's like, "Oh, it's a CBD infused soda." You're like, okay, take it out, test it. You won't find anything inside of that liquid.
See, if I've ever had a drink that was CBD or food CBD, or even in my vape, if I've used a CBD juice, the most I've ever gotten was a numb tongue. It was nothing.
But that could be any number of things too, Robbie. Like that could be, uh, who knows what else is in that drink? Who knows what else is in the vape? It really could be anything else in there, or it could be CBD, or it could be THC, or you could have significant amounts of lead or of whatever that's in it because nobody's making sure it's safe.
Does it get difficult trying to keep up with all the trends that all these different forms this drug can kind of be marketed as?
Yes.
Because I have friends who are cannabis chefs, and I've seen they've tried to do it respectfully, like make sure they're giving people accurate information based on like actually looking at the information and making sure that they like selling a book on it. They're going to make sure everything is processed properly. Um, but it's also confusing to me because even they talk about it, like even they'll warn on some things and they'll get the hateful comments. But there's also so much to expand your category out there, whether it's a soup or whether it's things that I couldn't even imagine. But now they're even selling gummies that are psilocybin. And I'm like, Wait a minute, I'm not even going to touch that. There's no way." But it's like, "Oh, it's a microdose." I'm like, "Oh, look, I don't know what it is, but that's ridiculous to be selling in a store."
Especially with no oversight. This is the thing I keep coming back to with it, man, is there is no way of knowing that what they're selling is what they're saying. It is. Now, like your buddies, if you get conscientious people, fantastic, we've got that. But business is not conscientious. Like these multinational corporations that are selling most of this, it is absolutely not about doing the right thing. Don't let their bullshit campaigns fool you. It's about making money and enriching their shareholders and their executives. So you can, I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen, man. We've been saying this for 15, 10 years because the Drug Policy Alliance, the folks behind all this, um, had this all published on their website. It's gone, but one of my friends, Kevin Sabet, has a image of it. Um, they said we're going to start with recreation or medical marijuana, go to recreational marijuana, then go to medical hallucinogens, then recreational hallucinogens, and then non-prescription medical opiates. So letting people use heroin, etc., for medical purposes, and then recreational opiates, and then ultimately will be recreational amphetamines. The goal is absolutely in the commercialization of everything. Their CEO at the time, a guy named Ethan Nadelman, gave a TED talk, TED International, in which he described all drugs, not just cannabis. He described all drugs as, and I quote directly, an undeveloped global commodity. So the intent is to be able to sell all of these things to make money on them. So I'm not surprised that psilocybin, the next move you're going to see is for people to be able to administer their own opiates.
Now, that's so crazy. I can't pick. I don't know. I can't picture that, but I also couldn't picture like some states legalized everything, and then I was like, I don't think that's good either. Like, because where I'm at, located nearby is Baltimore, and there's people that do drugs and just not out in the street. And there's some people just go on with their day and don't see a problem with that. But I just look at like that could be anybody, that could be any one of us that gets put in a situation where we feel like we have to turn to a drug like that. So I guess my concern is when it comes to oversight, it does it have to be something that's more does it have to get to a point where it's more profitable than big pharma pills for someone who actually has power and political influence to be able to once it get behind looking at this a little bit deeper? Because it seems like it just hasn't reached the official high level what's going to make them the most cash. It makes them money, but it doesn't make them as much as other pills and other things that get influenced. Because I think it's like 228 members of the House of Representatives or Congress that is influenced by big pharma, Republican and Democrats. And it's ridiculous. I think Lori Little is the famous one who came out and said, our duty is not to our customers, it's to our shareholders. And she's a
Yeah,
pharmaceutical
that's
rep.
that is actually that's a legal explanation. Like if you their fiduciary duty is to the shareholder. So I could make a pretty good argument that the moral thing for a corporation to do is to enrich their shareholders, not to do what's right by everybody else. I mean, it's how the law says they have to do it. I think the is the root of your question. When are we going to start to care about this, or when will big pharma take it over?
I mean, you can honestly answer either one of those, but I guess when do we actually see politicians talking about the concern when it comes to the use and selling of cannabis? It seems like everyone's just kind of hopped on the legalization board, but only as just to get votes. I don't see anybody actually generally diving into the discussion on it.
Just to get votes. So um, I'm a bit of a student of drug policy and history in this country. You remember um, there was a while where crack was killing everybody and nobody gave a shit. And the reason nobody gave a shit was because the everybody crack was killing were black people. Then it got out in the mainstream. There was this basketball player who, but it was actually cocaine. It got out in the mainstream, and you started to have politicians' families, white politicians' families, actually be impacted by crack use. And then they started to care. Heroin has been a scourge in this country forever, but heroin has always been a street drug, a junkie's drug, i.e., a minority's drug. We didn't start to care about it until you started seeing white people overdosing from it. The thing that I will continue to insist about our country is that no one will give a shit until somebody who looks like them gets hurt. And to look like them, they've got to be affluent and white to look like the lawmakers that make up the majority of this country. So, unfortunately, fortunately, I don't know, it is starting to impact lawmakers. I get the personal phone calls. I get weird phone calls, man. Politicians, Hollywood shit, like and I'm telling you, it is affecting lawmakers who work on state levels and on national levels. And that's how change is going to come about. Laws don't get made because someone's trying to do the right thing. Laws get made because they think it'll get them votes. And unfortunately, you need tragedies for people to respond to and make laws. Um, the more rich white people who are affected by this, the sooner the change is going to happen. And that is a sad reality about how our country works, but it's always worked like that. We don't get bent out of shape when things happen to black and brown people. We get bent out of shape when things happen to white people.
If there does start to be a turnaround in the way that lawmakers are looking at this a little bit more closely and trying to make good standards, even if it's on a state by state basis, are you also concerned about what happens when that does happen? Because there's always an unintended consequence, and that would probably be people pushing and ramping up even harder to try and use the drug even more because of this kind of, I wouldn't say it's forbidden, but it starts to enter that discussion. Like there was a bit of it back in the day when you used to smoke. There was a bit of, are we going to get caught? You know, you're hiding behind whatever and you're doing that. It will be like that again if the state starts trying to really put regulation and restrictions on it, which I'm like, how do we have a balanced discussion to bring the people up to the level and bring the lawmakers down to the level to have this rational discussion about, okay, there needs to be some restrictions like age ranges if you're going to sell it. You can say 16, but just because they might have a fake ID and they might be your friend, you'll still sell it to them anyway. So how do we get it to a point where there's ramifications if you use it underage? You should give a age gap. There's that for cigarettes, and I understand there's that for cannabis, but there's not really any enforcement on that.
This is why I like talking to you, man. And when you call, I do is because you think more than just at the surface of it. So yes, there will be unintended, and the nature of unintended is who knows what it's going to be. We don't know. I'll tell you that the single biggest contributor to youth use, and youth use is the problem. Okay, with everything, brother, with tobacco, with alcohol, with any substance, youth use is the problem. Like the more you can delay that use, the lower the odds are of bad things happening, to put it concisely. And the single biggest contributor to youth use is perception of risk. So the more dangerous a kid thinks it is, the less likely they're going to use it. If we make it legal on the national level, I absolutely think you will see a reduction in the perception of risk for a little while. The reason why kids in this generation don't smoke cigarettes today, they, and they've turned to vaping because we haven't given them the appropriate risk with that, but they don't smoke cigarettes because you scared the hell out of them. There was the Truth campaign, there was all that money from the tobacco settlements, and they grew up seeing it different. That same thing's got to happen here. And I want to your question about the youth and how you make that a thing, dude. I can answer that so simply, and have suggested this to every lawmaker I've ever talked to. The industry is never going to allow it to happen. There's a thing called RFID tracking that states require for the growth of cannabis plants. Unfortunately, very few people are doing it because nobody's enforcing it. But in theory, we should be able to look at and run a pretty simple test on any piece of cannabis or THC and see who grew it and who sold it. It's got a specific genetic code that we can say that was at X dispensary. My proposal is anytime an underage person gets caught with the substance, you fine the person who sold it. And the problem with this is they're going to be like, whoa, whoa, we didn't sell it to the underage person. We sold it to someone else who gave it to him. Who cares? That's where you let money rules everything. That's where you let the financial incentives fix it. Because if they're getting fined at higher and higher and higher levels, I think business will figure out a way to keep it out of the hands of kids to save their money. That's the best solution I got for it, and I think
I
it would
like
work
that a lot.
really
Yeah.
cleanly,
Keeping
right?
if you make the person, it's kind I mean it's a lot like if you do like a sanction or embargo like the United Nations does. You're making it to a point where you're incentivized to follow the rules and play the game rather than trying so hard to either profit off of it because that's more incentivized. Well, you're going to end up getting a bigger fine in the long run. So now you're more responsible. So you're like, well, I'm not going to make something with that high of a potency. So if it does get out of the hands of the person that I didn't sell it to originally, I don't get in trouble because it was under what it was supposed to be.
The problem you got, man, is these laws in every state that have legalized, they are written by the lobby who's profiting from them. These are DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, um, written, and then sort of now it's the industry who's taken that whole thing over. And so you have, like, take Colorado, for example, you have caps on fines. Like, it's something ridiculous. Like, they can't be fined more than $500 for anything they do or something like this because people trying to fix this aren't the ones writing the laws. The people writing the laws are the ones who are selling the product. So of course they're putting these ridiculous caps in it, and a fine is nothing to them. If we took that power back and wrote the laws, which I've helped craft a dozen of them, they just haven't been implemented. We could absolutely build financial incentives into it for the companies to do the right thing. They won't do the right thing because it's right, but they will do it because it's profitable.
Now, what about an establishment of an oversight committee that would be non-governmental, but would have a bunch of people like yourself that would be advocates for at least having a rational and reasonable discussion about cannabis usage and also regulation as well, too. I don't think you can have anybody from the government get involved because I just haven't come across a politician that hasn't been uh, greased at some point. But I would see a bunch of people that have actually experienced, like I believe you would have to have a certain number of hours of work with people that have used cannabis and had been addicted to it and are seeking treatment, just because you would understand that experience. And if you tried it yourself, then I would probably appreciate that more because then you know what it's like using the drug before. Obviously, like I said, I can criticize as much as I want about cannabis, but I use nicotine vapes all the time too. So I really got to kind of come at this with a balanced point, which is you need to have experienced it and you need to understand some other part to the argument, which is the one that's not being talked about as much, at least in public circles and social circles.
I love it. I mean, you got essentially what I feel like you're describing is like your classic think tank, where you've got some sort of privately funded group of subject matter experts who make recommendations on certain things. Um, I love the idea. And I think that, well, I'll say it this way. I hate to do debates because it's confrontational from go, but I'll do them all the time, whatever. I like to have conversation. Every time I do a debate, I make sure that I'm walking into it willing to have my mind changed. If I walk into it entrenched in my idea and saying, I'm going to kick this guy's ass, I need to stop. I need to walk into it being willing to change. It's why I go to pro cannabis events all the time. I read every single thing that the cannabis industry, all their newspapers, I get them all their e-news, I read them all every day because I'm willing to learn the other side. And I think that what we would need would be people from that other side willing to learn and to hear about what we see. And there are more of them. Um, I love the idea of a privately funded um, think tank that's got lots of different perspectives.
I'm curious, when you go to one of those cannabis events, do you just have someone that's so ramped up on the pro cannabis side that they're not even listening to anything you're saying when you're just trying to bring up reasonable points?
The vast majority of the time, yeah. So I'll tell you what, man. Like I don't go to him as some sort of like disciple trying to convert the sinner. Like I actually do go to learn.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, there's definitely plenty of things I've been like, okay, sitting in this commercial isn't worth my time anymore, and I'll leave the session. But there also are plenty of times when I'm like, oh shit, I never knew that, and then I get to research it a little bit. So I don't go. I really, honestly, man, like I go with the intent of learning more than with the intent of challenging.
I find it that when you start talking to someone about it, as long as you bring up like, oh yeah, but you can't experience like a psychosis thing. If I brought up a personal example, then they'll be like, oh, you just didn't have the right setting or you didn't have this type thing. And I'm just like, do you need all that for as much as the drug that you've been spouting has this carefree take it attitude? It's like Timothy Leary back in like the
Yeah,
70s, like
man.
or repeating the same thing. And I've started to notice that like I'm not trying to stump them on something, but I'm like, you notice the kind of the pothole there that just doesn't make sense. And they kind of go, okay, which means the public is willing to change their perspective no matter how much they might be on the other side. It's like, it stop looking at this at sides. Look at this at like just having a healthy discussion about something that's going to soon affect every single person that's alive, whether you take it or not.
What you say's got a lot of wisdom in it, in how we approach this and what we say and how we talk. And I'll tell you the thing that I say. It's just what you are, only different words. Is when somebody's like, "Yeah, yeah, but it's fine here. Yeah, but look at all these people who use and are great. Yeah, but it's never done this to me." Um, Basically, what I try and get at is your experience the totality of the human experience, or could there be people who interact with the world differently than you? I can say to folks, I know lots of people who drink alcohol and drink it very responsibly. My wife, for example. Um, does that mean that the person can't be an alcoholic? And they'll laugh at that and say, well, of course not. No, like some people can, some people can't. So we say the same thing with this. Like, look, all I'm asking you, I am absolutely willing to hear your point and consider it, that this doesn't hurt you. It's fine. Shit, it's making your life 10 times better. I will listen to that. What I ask is the same respect back that you listen when I say, but my world sees the down. My world sees the pain and the destruction and the addiction. Can you at least admit that that might be out there? Um, the trick is to get us to move away from thinking that our experience is the only experience.
How impactful is the culture when it comes to obviously shows, movies, and different networks that are now distributing things that are pro cannabis and really kind of focus on like the craziest, either ideas, creations, but it's a part of our culture now as much as it was back in the day, even more so, but it's the opposite. It's not steering people away from it and saying it's this demon drug and doing reefer madness films. It's been a whole stoner culture that has kind of evolved. And I enjoy those movies. Pineapple Express is hilarious. But
Yeah, right.
there's just a lot now that it seems like there's always got to be a stoner type. There's always got to be this. And I'm like, well, that kind of influences the culture a little bit when you really talk about that stoner doesn't ever do anything but some funny shit. And that's what people are going to start perceiving as that's going to relate, especially with kids' cartoons.
Oh, dude, this comes back to the perception of risk for young people. Like, um, if we told the whole story, it'd be much better. Let them make the choice. Like, I don't want to be anybody's big brother. I don't want to tell people what to do, but I'd like them to have all the information that they need to make a good decision. And if we could tell the whole story, the nuanced one in these, it would be good. I'll tell you that I am starting to see a bit of a shift with it, though. Like, there is more willingness to talk about the downside, and I've even seen that in media, um, because there's just so much of it. People can't really hide from it the same way that they did. But yeah, man, like making light of is is scary.
Do you think we're going to go in a positive direction in the next couple of years with this?
No,
Really?
But, but my friend, I don't see us moving in a positive direction on just about anything. I think, I think we are so divided as a nation, and we are so far away from the ability to have rational disagreement and discourse where solutions are sought rather than mic drop moments. That I really do fear the direction that all of these things are going. And drug policy is so nuanced and so difficult to nail. And we could absolutely do it. There are thinkers in this country, some of the greatest thinkers ever to have lived are alive today. We could do it. I just don't think that we have the willpower as a nation to see anything through. I think we want clickable, fast hit articles. I think we want influencers telling us what to do and sponsored news stories that we accept as the real thing. I don't think that we're going to push for the change that needs to be made. What the American public can do is sit back and say, well, the politicians aren't. You should write this in the book too. They're only there because we let them be there. Um, nah, man, I don't think we're going to take this in the right direction. I think that it's got to get a lot worse before it gets better around here.
Are you surprised at the number of like media sources? Like, I'm not saying I'm media, maybe alternative, but people that are at least of younger age that are trying to really understand the discussion a little bit. I've heard you on some podcasts. You've done a great job explaining it to people, but it seems like there's a lot more concern amongst, other things and not just doing a whole cannabis focused podcast. There's people that are actually concerned about the health impacts and kind of looking at a different discussion. I mean, has that been surprising for you?
Surprising, no, hopeful, yes.
Okay.
Um, I I think so. You asked me, and I said I don't think it's going the right way, and that is a very negative, very pessimistic way of thinking it. But it's what I think is the truth. But if I don't maintain some hope that we can change, I mean, shit, man, I'm in the recovery world. That's what I do. Like I always have to hope there's change. Um, who knows what this next generation is going to bring? And I'm the very end of the Gen X. Everybody who's coming after this, there are so many things that they think more about than we ever did. They are willing to have conversations about their mental health that we never were. We didn't do that. They're willing to have conversations about subjects that were taboo. Uh, um, the second person I knew, a close friend I knew, who killed themselves when I was a kid, killed himself because he was gay. And we all knew he was gay, but like you couldn't be gay in the early 90s. If you were gay in the early 90s, everybody called you gay. And like we use that as a pejorative. And today, that's not an issue with these kids. They will raise their hands and ask for mental health help in a way that we never would. So yeah, man, there's definitely hope. What we need critical thinkers. We need stuff like this. We need people like you who are willing to engage in conversations and think about them critically and not just parrot what it was they heard. Um, I don't think schools are teaching critical thought nearly as much, but I think that the human condition yearns for it. Um, no, we're not without hope. Let's see what these next generations do. They got a lot to fix, but
You mentioned a good point, but the education system kind of playing the role a little bit. They did the DARE program, which really wasn't that good, but if they had a better system of having teachers teach a class on just these are the things that you're going to be experiencing in the world, especially at a point in high school, like that's when people are getting ready to leave and be an adult for the first time. And I'm sure they've already tried things before, but just having a discussion about it in a more rational way. I mean, we can afford that in the education system. I feel like just one little separate class or something. But I don't know. I'm with you on I wouldn't call it pessimism or pessimistic. I would call it realism. There's not really a whole lot of things that have really stopped happening. when it comes to some serious drug problems. There's been changes, but fentanyl's still an issue, and I barely see politicians talking about it as much as they should be talking about it. But I'm a little bit hopeful, like you said, with the younger generation. I've noticed more concern, and I'm only 26, so I'm not old or anything, but hopefully not. I'm looking and examining more about kids in high school that are actually, I'm not going to drink tonight because I don't want to drive and I don't want to end up doing that and putting myself in this situation. I'm like, that's smart. I would have never thought of that. I would have been like, where are we going and how can my GPS get me there? Um, so I'm happy to be able to talk with you again. Like I said, hopefully we don't have to wait a year before we do another one. But Mr.
Nah,
Court,
brother, this is fun. My
is there
pleasure.
is there a place where people can find any of your links?
I don't know. I probably need to make one with the book. I no, dude, I do jack shit on social. I'm old, man. Like I had a MySpace account and I think I have a Facebook account, but I don't know if I even know how to log in.
I still follow your Twitter. I'll link the Twitter in there.
Oh, okay. I need to do some Twitter. Then I'll do some tweet. Nah, that's the wrong word. It's called X. It's hip now. Um,
I'm not changing.
all right, Twitter. I'll, I'll tell you what. Here's the deal. You put a link to the Twitter, and I will do at least 2 tweets in the next week. And we'll see if it can start to get regular because I'm always thinking of stuff, and I usually send it to friends who have active Twitter accounts, like my friend Kevin Sabet, who I mentioned, and follow his. But yes, you put a link to the Twitter, and I'll post a couple things on Twitter.
And of course, I'll link the Amazon books in there as well too, just to make sure people can be able to check out your work on the THC industry.
Dude,
Um,
it's sold out. The first book is gone. I don't even think there's any more on Amazon. So this next one should be out next month.
okay, well, I'll make sure I'll go back to this episode and I'll link that in the description. But Mr. Court, it's been a pleasure chatting with you again, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next.